We have 3 scripture readings this evening, starting with the Gospel of John, chapter 5, beginning at verse 25. Very truly, I tell you, the hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For just as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not be astonished at this, for the hour is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and will come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. Our second scripture passage is from the letter to the Romans, 2 verses from chapter 10. First, verse 14. But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? Then going to verse 17. So faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the word of Christ. And finally, Psalm 62. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall never be shaken. How long will you assail a person? Will you batter your victim, all of you, as you would a leaning wall, a tottering fence? Their only plan is to bring down a person of prominence. They take pleasure in falsehoods. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. Selah. For God alone my soul waits in silence, for my hope is from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my deliverance and honor. My mighty rock, my refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Selah. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate, an illusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no confidence in extortion and set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, do not set your heart on them. Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God and steadfast love belongs to you, O Lord, for you repay all according to their work. This is the word of the Lord. So faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the word of Christ. It began when he was so little he couldn't remember the first time, but there it was, his mother singing to him. She had a small voice with a light, smooth sound, and he realized with some embarrassment much later that he had always associated it with angels. How childish. But still, well into his teens at least, the memory of being held in her arms while she crooned him some song or other could bring him to a sense of well-being few other things could match. Go to sleepy little baby, go to sleepy little baby, and when you awake, we'll patty cake and buy you a pretty little pony. When he was 17 and the first girl he'd ever loved broke his heart, a song came on the radio that expressed not only his sadness, but a kind of restlessness, a new feeling that he was in a box too small for him. Runaway. He knew that while our hearts were young sounded strange on someone who still wasn't old enough to buy a beer, but the loss of that girl had made him somehow older, wiser, like someone who had lived. 2 years later, in the middle of basic training at Fort Drum, someone put a 45 on the record player after personal time had commenced at 2000 hours. "She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah," the Beatles sang, and a new door opened. The energy spun around the barracks while the recruits wrote their parents and their sweethearts and laughed at each other's jokes and cleaned their weapons and practiced bouncing quarters off their beds. Within 5 years, all the men in that room had seen action in Vietnam, and a third of those had come home with military escorts, carried into their parents' churches, draped in the stars and stripes, and buried to the plaintive sounds of taps on the bugle. He came home with his gear and married the second and last girl he ever fell in love with. In her parents' church, watching her come down the aisle while Wagner was played on an organ and swelled and filled the room. Forever after that stupid music made him tear up, he just couldn't forget how hard his heart was beating when he saw her, how beautiful she was. The music was all mixed up with her beauty, all tied together with his heart pounding. And then at some point in his 30s, after 2 kids had come along, but before they were in school, and after he'd gotten his first promotion at work, but before he decided to go out with his buddy to start a new firm, the beautiful girl said, "You know, we should get these kids to church sometime. They aren't even baptized." He wasn't sure. It wasn't native to him. The first visit was awkward, and they felt lost in the great crowds of people at the second service. But the minister didn't seem like a complete dope, so they tried again. Over coffee afterwards, they talked to the buddy from work and his wife, who was a great girl, really smart. And you know, they had a couple of kids too, and the kids didn't kill each other, so that was good. And they settled into a weekend routine at that church. They learned names, and their names were learned. They even baptized the kids both at once. The baby didn't like it much, but it was just what the big brother loved. Splashing water, being the center of attention, and a big fuss with cake afterwards. And there was a song that somehow hit him like a bee sting. He wasn't really sure why. He was in the thick of office politics at the firm, and he was feeling that every weekday had stresses he was wearing in all the muscles in his shoulders and back, and some of them in his stomach. Stresses he couldn't even articulate to his wife, who had stresses of her own, taking care of the kids, trying to figure out how and when to start teaching again. But there was this song, this hymn, it came after the baptism, and it gave him a lump in his throat. He couldn't even say why. I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Come unto me and rest. Lay down, thou weary one, lay down thy head upon my breast." I came to Jesus as I was, weary and worn and sad. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad. It hit him so hard he was afraid he actually might start crying there in that church full of people. And after the service ended, he looked back in the hymn book to make sure the words said what he thought they said. And it felt as if somewhere in him a tiny key had been placed into a lock he didn't even know he had on his heart. And it had been turned, and, well, he didn't know what. Something had happened. He listened then. He listened harder. Sometimes the sermons Well, one would go by and he would realize he had spent the whole time wondering which lawnmower to buy to replace the old rusted push one. But every once in a while, that okay pastor who wasn't a dope would say something that made him feel like maybe the guy had hidden cameras in his office or had been talking to his wife. He knew that wasn't true, of course, but still, it was uncanny, the things he heard. Then there was the call. He got a call from the principal at his wife's school telling him to meet her at the emergency room. His wife had been taken in by ambulance. She'd passed out while teaching an Emily Dickinson poem to 10th graders. The kids were older now, 1st and 3rd grades, and they'd been hoping for another for a while. The principal wouldn't say what had happened, causing a terror in his gut to burst into flower as he slammed down the phone and grabbed his coat. And there he was, alone in the car for what was probably the longest 12 minutes of anyone's life ever. He remembered what they had heard in high school about rockets re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, that something happened that blacked out all communications for a few minutes. Supposedly it was normal, but it sounded terrifying. And that was how this felt. He could imagine it all, the G-forces on the body, the ungodly burn around the rocket, the claustrophobia of those terrible spacesuits. And the silence, he had no idea, but he imagined a silence so profound you might lose your mind. And in that silence, he prayed, Lord, Lord, and then he broke off, incapable of going on. But the awful silence had been broken because he knew that someone was listening. He knew he had been heard in all his terror and with all his questionings and all his imagining. He knew God had heard it all, maybe even before he had spoken aloud. It was an ectopic pregnancy. She lost the tube, but she was okay. When he finally saw her, she was shaky, not long out of surgery, pale, a little teary-eyed, but smiling. He leaned in close and said, honey, honey. And they both closed their eyes and listened together to the sound of one another's breathing. And she said, thank God. And he said, thank God. And they both knew it was the truest prayer they had ever prayed or heard. And holding tight to her, not letting go her hand, he hurried alongside the gurney as its squeaking wheels carried her down the hospital corridor to the safety of her room, where there would be nothing more terrifying than an old IV bag being changed. He sat next to her bed and noticed that it was back. That same sense, that old, familiar sense of well-being he knew from his most ancient of days. And after the nurse left them alone with the lights dimmed, with a voice scratchy from fatigue, he sang to her. His first instinct was to sing what his mother had sung to him, "Go to sleepy, little baby." But then he realized which lullaby he needed to sing to his wife, his sweet wife, after this near miss, after this day of terrible silence and grateful prayers. To his dear and only one, whose face was already relaxing into an exhausted, healing sleep. I heard the voice of Jesus say, I am this dark world's light. Come unto me, thy morn shall rise, and all thy days be bright. I came to Jesus, and I found in him my star, my sun. And in that light